The war in Ukraine has once again cast a grim shadow over Europe as Russian forces launched one of their most extensive overnight assaults on the capital, Kyiv. The scale and brutality of the attacks drew swift and sharp condemnation, particularly from French President Emmanuel Macron, who did not hesitate to denounce Moscow's actions as acts of terror and barbarism. According to Ukrainian officials, the strikes rained down across 7 districts of Kyiv in the middle of the night, leaving a trail of destruction that underscored Russia's determination to break the will of both Ukraine and its allies. The assault claimed at least 15 lives, including children, while dozens more were injured. Residential areas were reduced to rubble, and several prominent international institutions in the city were not spared from the devastation. In his reaction posted on X, President Emmanuel Macron expressed both outrage and sorrow. His statement left no room for ambiguity. Macron said, 629 missiles and drones in a single night over Ukraine. This is Russia's idea of peace, terror and barbarism. More than a dozen dead, including children, residential areas and civilian infrastructures deliberately targeted, the offices of the European Union delegation and the British Council damaged. France condemns these senseless and cruel attacks in the strongest possible terms, full support to the Ukrainian people and deepest compassion for all the grieving families. This was more than just a diplomatic statement. It was a stark reminder of France's alignment with Ukraine and its commitment to holding Russia accountable. Macron's words placed Russia's offensive in the broader context of international law, civilian safety and Europe's security, signaling that Paris views these attacks not as isolated military operations, but as calculated attempts to terrorize a nation into submission. The numbers alone reveal the gravity of the overnight strikes. Ukrainian defense officials reported that more than 600 weapons, a combination of missiles and drones, were unleashed in the span of hours. For residents of Kyiv, this was among the most relentless nights of the war since Russia's full-scale invasion began in February 2022. 7 districts bore the brunt of the bombardment. Apartment blocks were reduced to charred shells, cars burned in the streets, and power outages left neighborhoods in darkness. Emergency services worked through the early hours, pulling survivors from the debris and rushing the wounded to hospitals already stretched beyond capacity. The strikes also carried symbolic weight. Among the damaged buildings were the headquarters of the European Union mission to Ukraine and the British Council, both institutions representing international cooperation and cultural ties. Their targeting suggested a deliberate attempt by Russia to send a message not only to Ukraine, but also to the West. Macron's statement immediately circulated across European and international media, drawing support from allies who share France's concerns about the escalation. European Commission officials echoed his condemnation, while Britain emphasized the significance of the attack on its cultural institution. The strikes came at a fragile moment in the war. Peace efforts, including recent initiatives led by US President Donald Trump, appear to have faltered with little sign of progress between Moscow and Kyiv. The Russian government has repeatedly dismissed Western proposals for negotiations, accusing Washington and its allies of fueling the conflict rather than seeking genuine resolution. In this climate, Macron's words gained even greater resonance. By calling out the deliberate targeting of civilians and international missions, he highlighted the erosion of basic humanitarian norms. His emphasis on terror and barbarism framed the strikes not as acts of war against Ukraine alone, but as a direct affront to European values and institutions. This is not the first time Russia has directed attacks at civilian infrastructure or symbolic targets in Ukraine. Over the past 3 years, Moscow has steadily expanded its strategy of bombarding urban centers, striking power grids, cultural institutions, and residential districts. The goal, analysts say, is to wear down Ukrainian morale, strain international support, and pressure Kyiv into concessions. However, the effect has often been the opposite. Each wave of destruction tends to galvanize Ukraine's allies, spurring fresh pledges of aid and reinforcing the sense that Russia is waging a campaign not only against Ukraine, but against the democratic world. Macron's strong condemnation reflects this wider European perspective. France, along with Germany and other EU states, has played a central role in sustaining sanctions against Russia and funneling military and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. By underscoring his full support to the Ukrainian people, Macron sought to assure both Kyiv and France's European partners that Paris remains unwavering in its commitment For ordinary residents of Kyiv, however, such diplomatic assurances may provide little comfort in the immediate aftermath of such devastation. Eyewitnesses described the night as a hellish experience, a relentless sequence of explosions, sirens, and the terrifying uncertainty of whether their buildings would be next. Parents carried their children into underground shelters, clutching blankets and food supplies as they listened to the rumble of air defense systems attempting to intercept incoming missiles. While Ukraine's air defenses successfully shot down a significant portion of the barrage, the sheer volume of attacks ensured that many projectiles still found their targets. By dawn, smoke hung over much of the city. Streets were littered with glass, twisted metal, and fragments of drones. Emergency crews continued their work through the morning, combing through ruins in search of survivors or additional victims. The timing of the attacks could also be viewed through a political lens. With peace efforts stagnating, Moscow may be seeking to demonstrate its ability to escalate at will, reinforcing its bargaining power in any future negotiations. The damage to international offices in Kyiv also carried a symbolic message. Russia is prepared to strike at institutions representing Western influence, even if they are non-military in nature. By targeting the EU mission and the British Council, Moscow effectively attacked not just Ukraine, but the very symbols of European presence in the country. Macron's condemnation, therefore, was not just about sympathy for Ukraine, but about defending Europe's broader stake in the conflict. His remarks reinforced the argument that what happens in Ukraine directly affects the continent's security and its values. Against this backdrop, the role of former US President Donald Trump adds another layer of complexity. Trump has positioned himself as a potential mediator, attempting to broker peace between Moscow and Kyiv, but recent developments suggest that his efforts have stalled. While Trump's initiative drew attention earlier this year, Moscow's rejection of European peacekeeping proposals and Kyiv's insistence on defending its sovereignty have left little room for compromise. The overnight strikes in Kyiv only underscore the gulf between the parties, raising questions about whether any meaningful peace negotiations are possible in the near term. For European leaders like Macron, the priority has shifted back to deterrence, solidarity, and resilience. His message was clear: Europe will not stand idly by as Russia attempts to terrorize its neighbors into submission. As families in Kyiv mourn their dead and tend to their wounded, the broader international community faces difficult questions about how to respond. Will the latest escalation push Western nations to step up their support for Ukraine, or will fatigue and political divisions weaken the resolve to act? Macron's words may serve as a rallying cry. By explicitly labeling the attacks as terror and barbarism, he placed the conflict in moral as well as strategic terms. This framing could influence upcoming debates within NATO, the European Union, and the United Nations about further sanctions, aid packages, and military assistance. For Ukraine, the struggle continues. Despite immense suffering, the country's leaders insist they will not bow to Russian pressure. Civilian resilience, bolstered by international solidarity, remains one of Kyiv's strongest weapons. The overnight strikes on Kyiv represent yet another dark chapter in a war that has already claimed countless lives and reshaped global politics. But they also reaffirm the battle lines between Russia's vision of dominance and Europe's defense of sovereignty and democracy. President Emmanuel Macron's words echoed across Europe not simply as diplomatic rhetoric, but as a reminder that Ukraine's fight is inseparable from Europe's own security. France condemns these senseless and cruel attacks in the strongest possible terms. Full support to the Ukrainian people and deepest compassion for all the grieving families, Macron declared, a statement that captures both the tragedy of the moment and the resolve of a continent.